I'm Avery.
And I'm Mel.
This is the Veda Lounge Podcast.
All things Vedic, cosmic, and magic.
For yoga teachers, entrepreneurs, creatives, and coming back to your own center.
We explore themes on living like you practice to knowing your nature.
Join the conversation for an embodied homecoming to illuminate your radiance.
Through getting nerdy with Vedic sciences and self-discovery, cozy into your cosmic cadence. All right, welcome back to the Veda Lounge Podcast. I am so excited today, you guys, to share and introduce Joanne Turner to you guys. So she is a graduate of our 200-hour training program, and she is also an immunologist, and she is currently serving as the Chief Scientific Officer at a scientific institute. And we're going to dive into all things research today. I am getting my nerdy cap on, and I'm so excited to have you, Joanne. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
I would love for you to share how your journey maybe even ended up in yoga training and just a little bit of your background in your journey with research.
Yeah, I'm really happy to do that. I actually never thought I'd be a scientist. My family background is working class. My parents had a fish and chip shop. That was their family business. And I just loved biology and ended up just following that path. And really took it seriously and went to college eventually after kind of playing in labs for a while, and then have just gradually moved up through that process. So I ran my own lab. I still run my own lab. And now I run a research institute where I make sure other people can run their labs successfully. But I really got interested in yoga probably in my 20s. And I had traveled to Africa as part of my research and spent several months there. And I came back and I didn't feel well. It turned out I had developed thyroid eye disease. And so I had a lot of pain in my eyes, and it was autoimmune stress induced. And I knew it was stress induced because I'm a scientist and I read it. And I realized I needed to manage my stress. And so I started working on ways to just always make sure, I didn't get stressed by things, or if I did, that I had really good coping mechanisms in place. And so things like meditation and yoga helped me with that. It just gave me the tools to take care of myself a little bit better. And I've carried that through my whole life. And so whenever I'm not feeling great, I make sure this is what I turn to. And then I start to feel healthier again. It makes me look after myself. And then I can deal with pretty much any stress coming my way as long as I have that little toolbox in hand.
The fact that you originally just had this love for biology, one thing I love so much about yoga is how it uses our own inner referral system. It's like our own internal way of resetting. I'm curious, when I first met you, right, and even just what you did for your practicum to bring yoga to scientists, and that journey, I would love for you to share anything on that experience as well, because it was so interesting.
It was fun to do. I'm surrounded by scientists who live in a very stressful environment. And I think what people don't understand about being a scientist is that you are constantly competing to raise funds to do your research. So I could have a brilliant idea that might cure a disease. I still can't do the work to prove that that's true unless I write grants and I teach class in an academic institution. And it's a lot going on, and you're under a lot of pressure all the time. And so I knew that I could help myself, but I saw all my colleagues around me struggling to help themselves, and they were getting overwhelmed, exhausted, making themselves sick, just not enjoying what they did for a living anymore. And science, it's discovery. You're right at the forefront of doing something no one's done before. But you live in this world of constant pressure. And so I wanted to introduce just tiniest bit of yoga to them in a way that they wouldn't be cynical and think that they shouldn't do it or say they wouldn't have time. So did it in work hours, did it in a chair, did it on Zoom, 20 minutes maximum, to just prove to them that they could do something for themselves that would make them feel better and cope better with the stresses. And they all showed up, and some of them showed up more than they needed to for that class, which was lovely. And some of them are still doing it to this day at some level to help themselves when they're kind of getting tense and stressed. So I just wanted to give them something that could help them manage the stress that I was imposing on them because I was their boss in a way, and saying, you must write grants, you must bring in money, and so on. And yet could hand something back to them that made it just a little bit easier in their day.
I love that so much. I think too is with jobs like that, especially when you're having to constantly prove, right? It's a
Mhm.
constant race to prove something. And I'm sure there's a lot of discouragement of like having a concept or even potentially, because this kind of gets into qualitative versus quantitative. Like just because
Mhm.
it felt good or just because there's correlation doesn't actually mean causation, and just how rigid those observational systems can be, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I worked on looking at cell responses, and scientists don't really work in descriptive and anecdotes. So someone saying something made them feel better isn't good enough. We have to measure it, and we measure it and we focus on probability. So we get into statistics and group size. And so you have to prove something within a specific amount of accuracy to say that it's real. And so sometimes when you're doing kind of just descriptive science, you can't always do that. But really, to get published in a journal that people would perceive as credible and to have your study taken seriously, you need to have a statistical significance that's saying essentially it's 95% sure this is going to be the actual outcome. And there's still a little bit of margin there. And then we also deal in reproducibility. So you have to be able to show it again. You can't just do something once. You have to do it again and again, and preferably someone else, some in a different place in the world, needs to replicate it. And if everybody comes up with the same findings, then we're pretty confident that that is real. Really good example is, I don't know if you remember way back when they said that vaccines caused autism. There's one study with about 12 kids, not randomly selected, and showed an effect. And then that has since been reproduced thousands and thousands and thousands of times in multiple different countries to prove that that wasn't true. And people believe that it wasn't true data because of that probability and reproducibility.
Well, I'm sure too. I remember when I did the mind body medicine program with
Mm.
Harvard, one of the big things that came up was like who is paying for research, and then
Mhm.
orienting research to get the results someone wants. And I'm sure this is, I mean, we're jumping into a very complex conversation right away. But how, as someone who wants to consume the literature of research, what would you suggest to listeners to be able to discern that kind of credibility and, if it's a genuine study versus a paid study?
Yeah, so it has to be written into the document. So if you're looking in a published article, way down in the acknowledgements, it will tell you who supported that study or whether they had any conflicting interests, right? So if you see, say, a pharmaceutical company that makes the thing you're working on give you the money to study it, doesn't mean it's not credible science. They could have put lots of controls in place, but it would make you think and question it. So most of us are supported by the government. So most of us are supported by taxpayers' money, right? We write to the National Institute of Health, and they give us money to do our science. So that science, if I write a grant, it gets reviewed by 20 other scientists who have expertise in my area. They score it based on whether they think it's good science. And then hopefully that will end up in getting money sent to you from the federal government. And then you're working with government money and taxpayers' money. So we really need to be spending your money wisely and not wasting it. And that would probably be, if you looked and it said NIH grant, something, something, that would tell you that it's been what we would call peer reviewed. And they're very rigorous, and they're very competitive. And so only the best quality science that's proposed is likely to get funded by the government. So that's a really good way of doing it. There's also a lot of other government agencies. But when you see a pharmaceutical company, for example, you just think twice. But people do have to declare that interest, and if they haven't declared it, then really they're not going to be publishing in those journals. It's a requirement, and it's a requirement to work with certain amount of rigor as well, do statistics and things like that. So when you see statistics in there, that will also tell you it's pretty credible science. And when you see a large group size, if you're working with humans, you wouldn't want to do 5 people, you'd want to do 50 or 500 or 5,000. The bigger the number, whether you've got a control group and a non-control group, those are all going to tell you that it's really good science. So if I want to say yoga helps people, I should have had a group where they didn't have yoga, and then I measured outcomes of whether they managed their stress better. Not just one group where I said they managed their stress better. Just them telling me wasn't sufficient.
That makes a lot of sense, and especially with yoga research, because there's a lot of things out there. I mean, honestly, every week I'm seeing new articles or new things, or even the declaration of like, hey, this is, now we know yoga does this or yoga does that, but it can be challenging to discern, going back to that correlation versus actual hard data, because something like yoga, the variables are so unique. And how would you say that when there is, whether it's meditation or yoga, because variables are so unique, how can maybe we discern a little bit more into those types of research?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really hard because you, you think about kind of who you're studying. You have a bias in probably people signing up for your studies for the most part. It's really hard to go and find a population who doesn't want to do yoga and say, I need you to do yoga for my study, but you could do that. That would be the best way to do it, right? Somebody who might be cynical and then give them the tools they need and they might report an effect versus individuals who choose to do yoga. There's barely kind of, you can think about certain demographics that would sign up, often more educated, often female, and you've biased your study already just through that. It's a challenge to do. The best way you can do it is think about getting enough numbers, control for all those variables, right? So try and make sure you've got men and women equally, different age groups. You can work with an epidemiologist who can actually control for all those variables that you couldn't take out of your study and do it really well. I'm not an epidemiologist, so they work magic, and it's not magic, but it's science, but it feels like magic when they can say, oh, I control for age as a variable. So it's just trying to be mindful of, I think, how people will interpret the group that you have. I would, as a scientist, always be capable of finding a flaw in your study. That doesn't mean it's not a credible result. It just means I'm trained to see both sides and to question everything. I think where you get down to what's important is how you message that study to the public who maybe aren't thinking that way. And it's very easy to be drawn into believing something. And so publishing in a credible journal, trying your best to make it as unbiased as possible, communicating in a way that's balanced. We're usually as scientists saying, here's my result, but here's some confounders that were in there that could have made the interpretation less strong. And you have to talk about those weaknesses and pitfalls. And so then whoever's reading it can look at that balance and decide for themselves if you're willing to tell them the pitfalls in your study, the things you could have done better, then it makes them trust your data a little bit more versus saying, here's my study, this is exactly how it is, and there's no faults with my study, it's just, it is what it is. I found all these amazing findings. So that language that you use is usually very balanced when you're really reporting science.
Well, that would make sense too, for if you were starting with a lower funded project, right? By being honest about those pitfalls, because my first thought is, how in the heck would you get 50 people for this group, 50 people for that group, like in the retention for to maintain that
Yeah.
study? Do you guys have methods and ways to foster that?
Yeah, well, we'll normally start with what we call a pilot study. So the little project I did for class, for example, had 6 people in it, showed a little bit of an effect, small. And that would be enough evidence for me to write to get some funding to do a study with more people. And so that's kind of how you build up that. And then if that data is interesting, you'd be able to write to do even more than that. What we sometimes do with people studies is incentivize. And so you try not to incentivize so much that you're attracting, you know, people that wouldn't balance your study, but we might say give a small cash payment. Some people would get a little bit more medical access to something, particularly if we're in underdeveloped countries, you might offer better healthcare. But you can't ever incentivize the point where you're really providing something that the rest of the population couldn't have. You couldn't give them $1 million, for example. And most of us, when we live in the world of science, have to get our studies with humans approved by an institutional review board for human subjects. And so we would have to propose our study and propose how we would incentivize people. We can't coerce anybody to do a study. You can't do a study in prison because somebody might feel coerced to participate, for example. You can't do a study on somebody who can't give consent. And so you couldn't go to, say, a nursing home with dementia patients because they couldn't give you consent. And so all of those things are managed at a level of kind of doing robust science in a scientific institution. So that's how you would either decide who you couldn't study or decide how you can ask people to participate. A free yoga class might be an incentive enough for somebody to want to do it and to sign up for a series. Like you might offer free classes, for example. That's too bad.
I mean, when you bring up with dementia, for example, though, I'm sure that creates a barrier with really being able to research it, right?
Yeah, it would, and they would put controls in place to allow you to do that. So you might have a caregiver give consent, for example. You might just manage the way you'd interact with that person, so that there's a level of risk that we measure in science. Is it minimal risk, moderate risk, maximum risk? So minimal risk is maybe filling in a survey. Minimal to moderate risk might be giving a blood sample, right? That's not really going to cause you harm. And so some of those things could be done. But once you start doing something invasive, then you have to really pay attention to getting that consent. For children, often the parents can consent. For someone who might not be able to decide for themselves, often a relative can consent. But those are very carefully managed.
Yeah, we ran into this with the work we were doing with the military because you can't, so the way that they were able to discern like if something was effective or not was just overall metrics. And,
Yeah.
but then it's challenging to actually publish it. And I'm curious, over the years of your career, have you seen science change? Do you feel like science is changing?
It's a good question. I think I need a different question to answer it. What specifically are you asking?
Well, honestly, my love for history, right? Like, because when you're talking about, prisons, for example, they can feel
Yeah,
coerced, right? And obviously, a lot of different responses are a byproduct of historical experiences
yeah,
that may have brought up those ethical challenges. But then if you start going back, and for those listening, kind of taking everybody back into some yoga philosophy, the autobiography of a yogi, and how they viewed yoga as physics, right? And it's a solid science in India, but then you come to the West
yeah,
and bringing in metaphysics, they're like, no, we don't do it that way. And just seeing the evolution of different perspectives on research, I'm curious, yeah, like hopefully that kind of gives some context.
yeah. It is how for yoga in particular, it is how it is talked about in the West. It's very different. Like, I really enjoyed looking at as a biologist, the physiology for me when I was reading the book about this muscle and that muscle and this is how it's connected, which was based on science and anatomy. and and then it made more sense to me, and then I understood what it was doing to my body. I think when you're starting to have conversations about how it's impacting your mind, that people sometimes don't want to believe that. They'll think there's really a bias of somebody they do yoga, they feel better, and you extrapolate a lot of feelings from that. And so I think people who aren't really believers would just think that isn't real. So I think it helps the more you have scientists participating in yoga and talking about it. When you get into the metaphysical, it's just hard for anyone to understand that from a general population. Unless you really get into the hardcore science to prove it, which most people aren't going to want to hear. Uh, the spiritual side as well doesn't always appeal to everybody. And so personally, I just think everyone can benefit from yoga just in general. And so getting them to do it and feeling better is half the battle. And then if they're curious, they'll read more. And the people who are skeptical, I'm not sure you'll ever really get them to do it or to believe it, but you might get them to do a little bit of yoga. You might just go, oh, why don't you do this stretch? And then when they've done it, you're like, you just did yoga.
Yeah, a lot of these noetic sciences, like mind body medicine and so forth, because the mind is it's non-physical, and even spiritual hygiene or mindset itself, from the stuff that I get nerdy into, right? Let's just use yoga nidra as an example,
Mm-hmm.
right? We can see if someone's doing a yoga nidra practice that, they're going from beta into alpha, delta, theta, delta, alpha. Like there's a cyclical brainwave shifting. And, this is going back to that causation correlation challenge. Like, is the yoga nidra doing it? Would it just be asleep? Are they just falling asleep? Right? There's those non-physical components that are hard to grasp.
Yeah, it's really hard to separate. Now, I would say that imaging is your friend, right? We now can image the brain activity so well, which if you went back 20 years, you would just say, this is going to happen. And nobody could visually see it. And now we can document that as scientists. So we can document sleep stages, and people really start to believe the importance of sleep stages, right? REM and deep sleep. And I would say that's become a population thing to pay attention to sleep hygiene. And I think yoga can kind of piggyback on that almost by saying, well, if you believe it with sleep, and everyone's got a bed that tells them how they sleep now, or a watch that tells them how they sleep, and they're doing that every day and looking, but you can then start imaging when somebody's going through a yoga practice or meditation and showing them the same effects. I think one day it will become more mainstream and people will be able to measure it on their smartwatch. And then you'll get people really starting to believe it more because they can see something like physical or data.
Yeah, and it's being socialized because having the watch and being able
Mhm.
to see heart rate
Yeah.
variability and
Yep.
again that associative benefits, which I find just so fascinating because the yogic texts that are so old was like this does this or this
Mhm.
helps this, and now we're able to correlate that. I'm curious if you have heard anything about. I know that there was just an article that came out about the connection between the heart and the brain, or just these multi systems. Now we're starting to see how these systems are connected, which again, mind body medicine is all about that. But
Mhm.
research is starting to support that. And do you feel that with this type of new evidence coming out, that it potentially could open up a lot more dialogue into research for the non physical components of health?
I would hope so, but when I live in my physical science world, I would say that's not really a conversation that the scientists I know are having. They're very much focused on the practical, like organ systems, the physical thing that they can see. That doesn't mean someone out there isn't talking about it, but I'm talking to people who are studying cardiac problems in children, and they're like, here's a physical fix for it, and not necessarily thinking about it in any other way that maybe they could modulate in different ways. But I do think there is definitely a movement towards stress management and the understanding that something that stressed you as a child or even in utero, right, or your mom was stressed, has a long-term effect on your physical body as well. And so all of that will eventually, I think, synergize really well when you think about mind body. But I think we're asked to prove things so conclusively. It's just very, very hard for people to make that leap. But they are starting to show a lot of emotional things that are impacting physical health. And I think we've all known that all along, but now they're proving it with data and large group size and statistics that now people can believe it.
It makes me think of as when we talk about like how having like a physical thing or something that is very measurable as a solution.
Mhm.
Because even with psychoneuroimmunology, talking about lifestyle and stress management, and I'm curious, I'd love for your input on any of this with cellular biology, because we're seeing that with mitochondria and the energy of literally how healthy a cell is, how that connects to biophysics. And are there conversations of biophysics happening as far as studies and more research on that?
Biophysics was the worst topic in college for me. And energetics, I hated that topic, but it was really right down to that molecular level of how a cell functions. Yes, there are a lot of conversations, and I actually also work on mitochondria sometimes, although I'm not in any way an expert. I had a student in my lab who was, and we were studying mitochondria in the context of increasing age and finding ways to modulate that mitochondrial function that allowed you not necessarily to age slower, but it helped your immune system function better to protect you against infection. So I think there's a lot to be said for membrane potential, energetics. All of those chemical pathways are really key, and they're all really functioning from precursors of chemicals that we have in our bodies or we can provide to our bodies. I'm not a great advocate of like stocking up on tons of multivitamins, but somewhere in there are things that your body needed and you didn't even know it needed. And it might not be the vitamin B that you're thinking of. It might be something very minor in those mixes that your body needs.
Well, it really is when we talk about the molecular level of our bodies and our health. And in a way, if we even change the perspective of metaphysics just to biophysics, I think one of
Mhm.
the big things that is inhibiting moving things forward is within the physics arena, where a lot of quantum understanding, there is the belief that though it happens at a microscopic level, it can't happen at these larger levels. But when we look at like today, there's the red light therapy, vibrational healing, vibroacoustic based therapies. Like the more that we're doing studies on cellular health, I think that there's some interesting phenomenon, right?
Yeah, I think it just requires more research. But at the same time, everyone will tell you that a cat purrs at a frequency that heals you, and everyone believes that because they want a cat, right? And yet when you're talking about frequencies, they're not necessarily thinking about that as a similarity. So sometimes I think it's using a conversation that people can understand, right? If you're talking about frequencies, most people aren't going to understand what that means. But if you start taking that down to the level of like your pet is doing this every day when it sits on your lap, it's purring. We know that that's relaxing and healing, and so getting it down to a relatable level, I
Yeah.
think is actually really helpful. And I think sometimes the conversations are around there, things that people aren't really grasping. And so you do have to, so I can talk about my science in layperson's terms, or I can talk about it at the level I talk with my colleagues, which people wouldn't understand. And a lot of scientific journals write in that style. So people don't understand the messaging. And then you have people doing things like TED Talks where you take such a really complex topic and you make it really understandable and relatable. And I think that's really important for communication. How do we get this across to the lay public without sounding like we're kind of trying to be kind of intellectuals?
That's a really
But
good point about accessibility, because even just for people to begin engaging and advocating, right? If they don't understand, because I feel like with technology on the rise, and I live by mind body medicine and lifestyle medicine. Like I'm a huge believer, like I would stand by that until the world rocks, right? Like, but the reality is that I know the nuances that exist with that. But if you give someone a device and they can hit a button and they're getting those frequencies versus meditation
Mhm.
where, they're more receiving that stuff. I think there's a lot more funding for products and things of
Yeah.
that nature. And yeah, and trying to make it, because it is really amazing what naturally we can do in our bodies. But that's a really good point about accessibility and understanding, because they're first. I wonder, do you think that part of it too is the placebo effect? Like if I believe this is BS, it does, right?
Yeah, maybe a little. I mean, the placebo effect is real. They've studied it scientifically, so we know it's real, which is useful. You can make yourself feel better sometimes without needing to take something. So I think that's real. I just think it's about meeting people where they're at. And so, finding what it is that people relate to, like wearables right now, watches, things like that, are helpful. You would talk about the stuff you're doing with the military where you wouldn't talk about the science. You would just be like, this is a stretch for you to feel better instead of like talking about it from the kind of yoga side. Same result, right? Someone could do a whole yoga class and never know it was yoga unless you told them at the end, and then they would realize it was good for them. But I think a lot of people balk at the word yoga. It's become something, at least, in the US, it's very mainstream and people are excited about wearing yoga pants and looking good and not necessarily the work they have to put in to get the benefit. And so there are probably people walking around thinking, well, I don't want to be that yoga,
Yeah.
and not realizing that if they embraced yoga, not all the kind of social part of yoga, that they could really, really benefit. So I just think it's really talking about it in a way that everyone can understand. And so just saying here's a stretch that would make you feel good, not even saying it's yoga, people would then find that more accessible, I think.
I mean, this really highlights this is really honestly a big edge right now within the yoga industry is how, especially as research and interest is increasing in this stuff, how are we taking this being inclusive, right? Accessibility and
Hmm.
inclusivity simultaneously to upholding the roots of yoga. So there is kind of this
Yeah.
dualistic challenge right now in the industry around bringing yoga to healthcare, like because they're saying you're taking the yoga out of yoga or you're sterilizing it.
Mhm.
And I've always, since 2012, I've always been about accessibility at first, because once someone just starts, then they can begin to learn. But if you
Right.
begin right away with Sanskrit and it's this psycho-spiritual practice, that's very invasive. And if we want to be inclusive and accept and make this accessible, I do think bridging into research and these arenas in simplified language is so important. But and then the other challenge of it for the industry is, well, if we don't call it yoga, do yoga teachers actually get the jobs, or do the therapists take it, or do these
Mm.
other, you see? So it's a very complicated dialogue. And for those listening, like, welcome to the yoga industry. It's like, it's very edgy on, the right
Right.
way, like what is the right yoga. But I really resonate with what you're saying, Joanne.
Yeah, I mean, if you want people to do yoga, you have to find a way to invite them in to do yoga instead of, you know, making it very difficult entry. If you taught everything in Sanskrit, I probably wouldn't be there in yoga class because I'd be like, I can't remember what any of that is. But if you just give me a name that I recognize, then I can do it. I can still get the benefit of it, and then I'll get curious about learning more and reading the books and understanding it. But yeah, the threshold to entry to yoga, I think for some might feel high if it's really coming from the place of a yoga teacher wanting to teach pure yoga and understand everything that comes with that, all the spiritual side and everything like that. A lot of people don't want to initially start that way, but they might have curiosity to get there.
Well, even the word spiritual, right? There's a lot of people would
Mhm.
hear that and associate it with religion when really,
Right.
and Joanne, I know you've heard me say this, but I always love the way the military describes spiritual health, which is just how do you get through hard times? It's what you do to get through
Hmm.
hard times, right? That psycho
Yeah.
emotional hygiene is so important. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm an atheist, but I would always say I just haven't felt the need to believe at this point in my life. Maybe one day I will, and then I'll change it. But I think People have to work with whatever it is that makes them get through life and cope. And I've not felt the need for that, but I certainly know that when I do yoga, I feel better.
Yeah.
It's not really a religion for me, but it's a practice that I know is something that makes me feel really good.
Well, and this is a perfect segue into, I mentioned it earlier with quantitative versus qualitative. And, would you say, especially to teachers, if they're collecting data, quick example, when I was doing work with the USO, they wanted data on the feedback from the participants on a program I delivered. And pretty much all of it, it was mostly qualitative, but they really wanted like
Mm.
the graphs and all of that. And I admit that I failed epically at that opportunity. I was like, because the stories were so heartfelt and their qualitative
Mhm.
feedback was so profound that I kind of
Yeah.
overlooked, rate this 1 to 5, right? What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on people trying to collect data and suggestions on managing both?
So I think it has to be anonymous, right? People can't feel like someone's going to read it and identify them, and that's when you get true answers. So that's always really key. The questions have to be written in a way that they can't be misunderstood. I've seen so many surveys where you get so I would say in my place of employment, the satisfaction survey in the workplace, ambiguous answer every single time. I look at the scores, I'm like, I don't know what it means because the question was so open-ended. And did people score it high or low for very different reasons? So you have to be very specific and be really clear about the grading. So sometimes 1 through 5, some people give a 1 as their best score, and some will give a 5 as their best score. So words are really key. Was it good? Was it great? Was it excellent? Or way better? Sometimes it's worth just consulting with someone who knows how to write qualitative and quantitative surveys. And I had amazing people working with me in my last job who worked in education, and they knew how to write a survey, and they were professionals at it. And so they would write your survey, you actually got useful data back instead of trying to do that yourself. So it's useful to find someone that can do that. There's a lot of people, particularly in like undergrad and high school education, who are doing research on it that know how to write really excellent surveys. But the descriptions that people give you, the narratives, are the ones that give your score power, right? Even if you said, every person in my class gave this the best score ever, it's like, well, that's interesting. But if someone puts a personalized narrative with that, that's just really compelling, I think. So both of them, I think, have a lot of value.
Yeah, because I think they're called what caricatures? What do they call them? Caricatures? I don't know. Like it's like basically where you like don't say the name of the person, but you like demographic, age, like you kind of give the
Yeah.
archetype and then their experience. But I
Mhm.
actually did not even realize, I mean, it makes a lot of sense that there are probably professional survey makers out there and people who
Mhm.
really understand that. And so, for people who want to get involved with research, right? I hear this a ton from our student population. People are interested in yoga research, meditation research. What are places that you would suggest for them to begin, and even potentially for like where to get grants and just any advice you would have for those seeking it?
It's a really hard question for me to answer, I think. So I don't live in that world enough to know where you would look. There are probably, foundations.
Mhm.
That's usually a good place to start so that someone may have set up a foundation, right? It's maybe a family that had wealth and started a foundation. Maybe they had some health benefits and wanted to give back. Or maybe they're studying brain science and have an interest in this. And so searching for foundations linked to yoga or any other discipline related to what you want to measure is probably the way to go. Foundations tend to give you a small amount of money, but if you're studying a population of people, it's not super expensive, right? So I work sometimes in mice, and I need, hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that work, and the equipment might cost $1 million to do the work as well. But even in a human population study, you can probably do that with a lot less money. So that would be probably the first stop, I think. But I also think, the government probably funds things through the National Institute of Health. I think they have more of an interest in mental health, and there's an Institute for Mental Health and Behavioral Health that probably has some grants out there for doing pilot studies or large scale studies. And so you would go to NIH and search for grants and then search for something that's in your wheelhouse and submit. They're very competitive. So the first time you submit, you probably won't get funded, but they give you a whole bunch of useful information on how to make it better. And sometimes it will go through 2 or 3 cycles, and then eventually they'll award you some funding. And that NIH funding is a great way for your credibility of the study to increase as well.
And to pursue that, are there accreditations? Like I know with the Foundation Center, for example, for foundations trying to give grants, a lot of times it's just to nonprofits. So if an individual wanted to try to get a grant, the likelihood is, it's a little more challenging. But with NIH, do you have to have your doctorate? Do you have to have certain things to even be eligible to submit for that?
They like you to be affiliated with a university or an academic institution because they give their award to that institution who manages all the paperwork and the reporting. And so you then just have the funds to spend and focus on research. And so usually that's how they want to do it. It's probably rare that they would fund directly to an individual. A foundation would be more likely to do that. You could also set yourself up as a company, right? And then they would fund your company. NIH would probably not do that unless you are set up to receive government funding.
Yeah.
So they expect very specific things from the institution they give the money to. But a foundation might give to an LLC, for example. So that's possible. That's probably easier than just a personal kind of application, but not impossible.
Yeah, and I found too, like building relationships. I don't have my doctorate, right? But building relationships with people within universities, there's a lot of opportunities. Like I don't have to be at the university, but to be able to support what the university is doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot. I find that it's especially like with something specific like pain management, like these really hot topics that they're looking for. There's more likelihood versus, this was a recent conversation, but, the gray matter in the brain, like, how does gray matter get affected by meditation? Probably chronic pain is going to be like go up on the interest for likelihood of getting grants and just observing.
Yeah, I think so. And so probably the best way to do that is if you had an interest in something is to find someone at a university or a research institute who works on something similar and just contact them. And then they might, if they have an interest, they may have a study and they've never actually met you, but you would be really valuable to them. They would then write grants and they could award money out to individuals doing the study, right? So if you, let's say as an example, you wrote to me and said, I want to study how this type of yoga or meditation will impact pain. I could connect you with somebody who works on pain in an academic setting in a very specific way. And if they had an interest in that question, they might connect with you and then they could write the grant. And then when they got the money, they might give you some money to run your study and they would help you work with that. So that would be the best way to do it. And you might get ignored by 50 people before one person said yes, because we get a lot of email
Yeah, I'm
and lots of
sure.
people wanting to do things. But it is possible to find connections that way. Personal connections are great. So you might offer to do some classes on a campus where you think there might be some connections that you can make, and then that's another way in. So you kind of have to do a little bit of hard work to get the academics to pay attention to you. But there's someone somewhere is going to find that interesting, and then they know how to write grants and they know how to do the surveys and write the papers and make sure it's powered up enough so it's significant and things like that. So those are useful connections.
Well, I'm sure people who are working on their doctorate or undergrad, like if it might match where it's perfect to help someone with some work they're doing. Yeah, that makes total sense. I love that. Thank you so much. This has been so fun. I have a question as we prepare to close this experience. in this episode is, what are things that you wish people really understood about research? I think a lot of people want to get involved. People make a lot of, I've had my moments where I'm like, yay, over research, and then WTF over research, right? Like lots of misunderstandings out there. And what do you wish people really understood about this work?
Well, and we're all very normal people first. When we get together as scientists, we don't sound like normal people. We talk in a very complicated way, but most of us go home to our families and we're just human beings like everybody else. I would say, but I like people to understand that I have a PhD that doesn't make me smart in general. It makes me very smart in a very specific thing, right? I'm an expert in this one thing, super expert in this one thing, but it doesn't mean I've got common sense. I just all sorts of mistakes. I can't fix things. I'm not very practical. It's all up in my brain. So that's something I think people often don't realize. They're like, oh, you have a PhD, you must be like really brilliant. And I'm like, no, not really. I still run out of gas in my car sometimes. And it's like, don't pay attention to stuff. Uh, we're pretty normal when we're outside of our science world. The other thing is that it's science is just hyper competitive. You imagine scientists like you see on TV and in the movies of having all the freedom to work on anything you wanted. And we're not. We really only work on what we can get funding for. So what interests me the most scientifically might not be what someone will give me money to study. So I'm not always working my dream job. I'm working where the money is, and it really is a stressor for us to find the funds to be able to do our job.
Well, and I'm sure too, there's just so many rules that, navigating by.
Mhm.
So, because yeah, I have colleagues and, even personal friends that were, literally being a doctor involved in research and then getting so frustrated by the system and being like,
Yeah.
I'm done, and
Yep.
so I know it's not an easy field, and personally, I have danced with the idea of going back to school to fully get like to really go that academic path. But I'm like, oh, my freedom. Like, I'm like, oh, I don't know. So I think I love that you share that because I think in a way, sometimes too, as even as if someone doesn't have their PhD, or just even to make a difference in the world, that people can
Mhm.
oftentimes think that, well, I don't have this, so I can't help the world or I can't make an impact. And
Right.
it's just not true. All of
I
us.
think when people ask me about like my role in science, I always say, like, let's imagine there's a big problem to fix, like a big health problem. My work, maybe that I've done for 30 years, nonstop, is one little jigsaw piece in a puzzle. And it'll interconnect with its neighbors that somebody else in another part of the world maybe is working on. And eventually, over time, you get the big picture, and then you come to find a cure for a disease. But my every day is like this tiny, tiny little contribution to a much bigger, like, body of work. And I get joy in that, knowing that's what it is. But if you go into science thinking you're going to save the world, you're going to be disappointed. You have to go in knowing that in aggregate, you're going to save the world, but not you individually. There's not a lot of personal glory in it.
Yeah, well, I think that what's so exciting about this work or with research and science, I heard the quote once that the best answers should always lead to a new question, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and I think it just signifies the evolution of being human too, as a collective. So yeah, and just
Yeah.
my hope is, especially as more stuff is coming out about the energetics and like helping to create things that are less invasive in healthcare, and being part of that journey and education for people in our communities to learn how to befriend the body, so we can elevate the medications or the interventions and the things that we're taking. Because in yoga therapy, we have a saying where we're like, our medicine helps your medicine, but your medicine helps our medicine. And there's a beautiful harmony going back
hmm
to the puzzle piece among the many.
Yeah. Yeah. We support each other, and really, it's nice. You need both. It really teaching people self-awareness is a lot of what you're doing because you have to pay attention to your body. And I think that's lost sometimes as we grow up. We don't really connect that way and think about that. When you get older and everything hurts, you suddenly become very aware that you should have paid attention to your body. But when you're younger, you just kind of like run through life and you're not thinking that way. So I like that, making that connection. It's like, yes, this thing you're doing is impacting your body in ways that you have no idea are good for you at that time. Earlier you can get to that, the better.
Well, I'm sure too you see in mitochondria, right? That like, I mean, metabolic age compared to actual age, like that's a whole thing that exists, right?
I always say I'm biologically younger than my husband, who is actually younger than me because he has way more gray hair. So I'm like, I work on aging from like my 20s. I understood what I needed to do to age healthily. And so I've always exercised and not overeaten and done all the right things to age better. And so whenever I talk to him, I'm like, you might be younger than me, but biologically you are older than me.
There you go.
And
That
doesn't
is
always like to agree, but
that is the best. That's so funny. Well, before we close, is there any other things that you want to share with the community?
I'm just a great proponent for yoga, even though I'm not always thinking about all the metaphysical and things like that. I just think it's try it, ask yourself how you feel before and after, and then use that as your evidence base, right? I felt better. Doesn't matter how you felt better. It's just like try it and see what the difference is. You felt good, try it again, and it'll keep building up and feeling good. So I think people can do their own experiment. And N of one, not statistically significant, but it's it's personal experience, and then you can kind of believe in how you felt.
It's so true. Also, too, experiencing it is so much more concrete than a theory about it, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
So, so powerful. Well, this was amazing. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your wisdom. There will be notes in the description for this episode if you guys want to check out Joanne's work and even just see some of the research that they do. It is incredible, and Joanne, truly a privilege to have you here. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us.
You're welcome.